For 18 years, it was the perfect crime. No suspects, no answers, just a river rock and a cold case file. What police didn't know was that the killer was already confessing, not in an interrogation room, but to a room full of strangers, because his greatest need wasn't secrecy. It was approval. This is the story of a boast that became a blueprint for justice. Police believed this case was a dead end. They were wrong. For 18 years, the file on Crystal Beslanowicz's murder was a monument to silence. Not because of a lack of evidence, but because the one person who knew the truth couldn't bear the weight of his own secret. He had to share it. This is a story told in 3 parts. By the end, you'll see how a killer's vanity, his psychological need to be seen as powerful, crafted the key that would finally lock his cell door. This is Behind the Crime Files. To understand the gravity of what was lost, you must first understand the fragile outlines of Crystal Beslanowicz's life. She was not a statistic. She was a young woman navigating a system with more exits than safety nets. Born in 1978, Crystal's childhood was marked by instability. She entered the foster care system, a world of temporary addresses and changing guardian faces. By her mid-teens, like many who age out of such systems, she was functionally on her own. Her world was the interstate corridor, a landscape of truck stops, 24-hour diners, and payphones. Survival relied on transient work, fleeting friendships, and a constant assessment of risk. In the fall of 1995, Crystal was 17. She spent time in Missoula, Montana, and then made her way south to Provo, Utah. Friends from that time describe a typical teen in atypical circumstances. A girl who liked music, who could be quiet, who was trying to figure out her next move. She carried her life in bags. Her safety was a daily calculation. Early December found her in Provo. She told an acquaintance she intended to go to Park City, the upscale ski resort town about a 30-minute drive east into the Wasatch Mountains. It was plausible. Winter was the hiring season for resort towns, dishwashers, hotel cleaners, lift operators. For someone living hand-to-mouth, it was a direction, and a direction was as good as a plan. On December 6, 1995, she was given a ride. Her destination was the area around the Provo River, near the Rocky Mountain River Ranch, a cluster of cabins about 8 miles east of the town of Heber City. Why? The answer died with her. Was she meeting someone who promised work? Was it a prearranged spot? Or was it simply a secluded place to spend the night? The last person known to see her alive let her out of the car. She faded into the gathering winter dusk. 4 days later, on the morning of December 10th, the silence of the riverbank was broken. A ranch employee performing off-season checks saw a form that didn't belong. As he approached, the shape resolved into something terrible. The body of a young woman, lying face down on the frozen gravel of the river's edge. The Summit County Sheriff's Office and the Utah State Bureau of Investigation descended on the scene. What they found was both brutally simple and forensically complex. The victim was immediately identifiable as Crystal Beslanowicz through personal effects. The cause of death was blatantly obvious: massive, catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head. But the murder weapon was not a gun or a knife brought to the scene. It was a part of the scene itself. A large, smooth river rock, estimated to weigh 15 to 20 pounds, was found near the body. It was stained with biological material. This was a weapon of sheer, exhausting physicality. The scene was a forensic nightmare. The riverbank was a public, though remote, space. The elements, wind, the proximity of water, scavenging animals, had likely compromised trace evidence. There were no obvious drag marks, no clear signs of a struggle preserved in the hard ground. It was as if the violence had erupted and then been swallowed by the landscape. The autopsy report would later provide the only loud testimony. The medical examiner documented not just 1 or 2 blows, but a series of crushing impacts. The force required was considerable. The pattern suggested a person bringing the rock down with focused, deliberate force, not a wild, swinging frenzy. This was a key early observation. Investigators fanned out. They canvassed the few nearby residences and the seasonal cabins. They tracked down truck drivers who used the nearby highway. They immersed themselves in Crystal's world, interviewing anyone who had known her in the preceding weeks. A portrait emerged of a girl who was cautious but trusting, who was always looking for a connection, for a way forward. But every lead seemed to fracture into more questions. The acquaintance who dropped her off had an alibi. The people she'd met in Provo had vague recollections, nothing concrete. The case, within months, began to stall. The case file was moved from the active desk to the cabinet. Let's pause the timeline here, at the point where the investigation first cooled, to analyze what the crime scene itself was communicating. The choice of the river rock is profoundly revealing from a behavioral standpoint. First, it is a crime of personal industry. Unlike a shooting, which creates distance, or even a stabbing, which can be quick, bludgeoning someone with a large rock is labor-intensive. It is loud with the sounds of impact, physically draining, and visually graphic. The offender does not flinch from this. He is willing to engage in sustained, hands-on violence. This often correlates with a need for absolute tactile control in the moment. Second, the rock is a weapon of opportunity, but its use suggests operational knowledge. Using the environment to your advantage indicates a degree of adaptability and, potentially, forethought. Did the offender know this location was secluded? Did he choose it for that reason? The act suggests he was comfortable there, or had assessed it quickly as suitable for violence. Third, the nature of the trauma. Focused, repeated, delivered with great force, points away from pure panic. Panic is chaotic. This was methodical. The medical examiner's note about controlled force is the critical phrase. The offender was achieving a specific, violent objective. This combination, personal industry, use of environment, controlled force, paints a picture of an individual who may see violence as a tool, a means to an end. The end, in this case, appears to have been the death of Crystal Beslanowicz and the disposal of her body in the river. The removal of her teeth, as hinted at in the later confession, is an act of forensic awareness. It shows an understanding of how bodies are identified, a desire to permanently erase her identity. This elevates the crime from an assault to a systematic attempt at annihilation. For such an individual, successfully committing this act and evading capture would not be a source of guilt. It would be a source of profound power. He has dominated another human being and outwitted the entire justice system. That power, however, is a lonely trophy if no one knows you own it. For the detectives, the case was going cold. But for the killer, a different process was beginning. The pressure of his secret was building, and it would seek a release valve in the most unexpected place. The years turned. The 1990s became the 2000s. The world entered a new millennium, but Crystal's file remained in the past. New detectives would inherit it, review the sparse materials, feel the frustration of their predecessors, and close the folder again. The turning point for the investigation, though not yet the case, came in 2008. Advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis, were revolutionizing cold case work. The Summit County Sheriff's Office, as part of a statewide initiative, submitted key evidence from old cases for new testing. The most promising item in Crystal's case was the murder weapon itself, the river rock. In 1995, DNA analysis could really only confirm a suspect. Now, techniques like PCR amplification could create a profile from minuscule amounts of genetic material, skin cells left from grasping the rock, sweat mixed with the victim's blood. The rock was tested, and, remarkably, a partial male DNA profile was retrieved. It was a complex mixture, degraded by time and the elements, but it was there, a ghostly signature left on the weapon. This profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database of offender DNA. The hope was for a cold hit, an automatic match to someone whose DNA was already in the system from a prior arrest or conviction. The database searched. No match was found. It was a devastating blow. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but it was attached to no name, no face, no record. It meant their offender had never been convicted of a felony that required DNA sampling. He was a ghost in the system. Investigators now had a new, agonizing task: to take this DNA profile and, without a database match, find the man it belonged to. They began the long process of familial DNA investigation, and re-interviewing old suspects to obtain voluntary samples for exclusion. It was like finding a single, unique key with no idea what lock it opened. So, by 2010, investigators were in a strange position. They possessed a powerful piece of scientific evidence, the killer's own DNA, but it was useless without a name. They were waiting for their ghost to make a mistake, to enter the system. What they didn't know was that the ghost was growing restless. He wasn't about to make a mistake with his DNA. He was about to make a mistake with his words. Given the killer's apparent forensic awareness, the rock, the mention of teeth, why do you think he felt so secure after 18 years that he would start talking? Was it overconfidence, or does it point to a deeper psychological need? In part 1, we saw how Crystal Beslanowicz was killed and how the investigation stalled for years, until a DNA profile from the murder weapon offered hope, but no answers. The killer was a ghost in the system. But ghosts, if they're human, get lonely. This part of the story moves away from the riverbank and into a rehabilitation center in Wyoming. Here, we'll witness how a secret, held for nearly 2 decades, became too heavy for one man to carry alone. His need for an audience would trigger a chain of events that brought the past crashing into the present. Our focus shifts to Riverton, Wyoming, in 2013. At the Life Skills Learning Center, a residential substance abuse treatment facility, a new resident named James J. White joined the program. White was in his late 30s, a man whose physical presence was immediately noted. He was over 6 feet tall, solidly built from years of manual labor in granite and marble fabrication, a job that requires immense strength. Fellow residents and counselors would later describe his demeanor. He was not a collaborative participant in group therapy. He held himself apart, often with an air of contempt for the process. He viewed the sharing of vulnerabilities as weakness. Instead, he used the group sessions as a platform to establish a hierarchy, with himself at the top. His method was intimidation woven with storytelling. He began with vague boasts about his capacity for violence, his toughness. He spoke of knowing how to handle himself, how to end conflicts. Initially, this was dismissed as the standard bravado of someone constructing a tough guy armor in a place where armor is supposed to come off. But the stories evolved. They became less about defense and more about procedure. He started talking about the logistics of making people disappear. He spoke with a chilling, matter-of-fact clarity about topics that had no place in a therapy circle. He mentioned bodies. He mentioned rivers. He talked about the importance of fire for destroying evidence. And then he zeroed in on a specific gruesome detail, the removal of teeth. "You take the teeth," he was heard to say on multiple occasions. "That's how they ID you. No teeth, no ID. The river takes the rest." The stories became more narrative. He began to reference a specific event. It was no longer a hypothetical how-to. It was a when I. According to multiple, independent witness accounts later gathered by investigators, James White told this story. He spoke of being by a river in Utah many years ago. He described it being cold, isolated. He described a girl. He described an altercation. And he described in explicit detail using a large rock from that riverbank to end the encounter. He did not express remorse. He expressed pride in his operational efficiency. He emphasized the silence that followed, the lack of any resolution. "They never found who did it," he reportedly said, a note of triumph in his voice. "They never even found the right piece of her. They had nothing. They still have nothing." This was no longer just dark fantasy. The details were aligning with an unresolved reality. One of the men in that circle was a former police officer from another jurisdiction. We'll call him Mark. Mark's training instantly engaged. The specificity was the alarm bell. The mention of teeth was the siren. In the Beslanowicz case, the fact that the victim's teeth had been damaged and removed was a closely held investigative detail, never released to the media. It was a control fact, something only the killer and the investigators would know. Mark faced an ethical chasm. The principles of group therapy suggested confidentiality. But the weight of what he'd heard, a potential confession to a decades-old murder, was crushing. After anguished consideration, he made a choice. He contacted the Summit County Sheriff's Office in Utah. He laid out everything he had heard. The name James White, the story of the river, the rock, and the teeth. For Detective John G., the lead cold case detective, this call was a lightning strike. After years of chasing DNA ghosts, here was a tangible name, attached to a statement containing non-public information. This wasn't a tip. It was a potential blueprint. The first step was verification. Did James J. White exist? Could he be placed in Utah in 1995? The answer to both was yes. Records showed White had lived and worked in the Wasatch Front region of Utah in the mid-1990s. He had a criminal history, though not extensive enough to land him in Cody's. Mostly misdemeanors, altercations, DUI. He fit the physical profile of someone capable of the murder perfectly. But they had a major legal problem. The rehab story was compelling, but it was hearsay. A defense attorney would shred it. They needed to physically link White to the 1995 crime scene. And they had one way to do it, the DNA on the rock. They needed James White's DNA to compare. And they had no probable cause for a warrant. They could not simply arrest him and swab his cheek based on a story he told in rehab. This launched a meticulous and patient surveillance operation. Detectives from Summit County and the Utah State Bureau of Investigation began monitoring White in the Salt Lake City area. Their goal was not to confront him, but to wait for him to discard an item that contained his DNA and was considered legally abandoned property. They followed him for days. They watched him at gas stations, outside convenience stores, at fast food drive-thrus. They needed a cigarette, but a drinking straw, a used napkin, anything that had been in contact with his mouth. It was a frustrating game of waiting. They watched him carefully dispose of trash in bins. They watched him be surprisingly tidy. The pressure mounted. They had their man in their sights, and the key to proving it was literally something he would throw away. They had the suspect. They had the DNA from the crime. All they needed was the bridge between them, a single piece of trash. And then, finally, James White gave them what they needed. On August 29, 2013, in a parking lot in West Jordan, Utah, the moment arrived. James White finished a cigarette. He took a final drag, and then, casually, he flicked the butt onto the asphalt. He got into his car and drove away. The moment his taillights disappeared, a detective, wearing latex gloves, emerged from an unmarked vehicle. Using forensic tweezers, he lifted the cigarette butt, placed it in a sterile evidence container, and sealed it. That small, discarded item, worth less than a cent, was now the most valuable piece of evidence in an 18-year-old murder case. It was rushed to the Utah State Crime Lab. The process was methodical. Extraction, amplification, analysis. The DNA profile from the cigarette was compared to the partial male profile from the river rock. The result was definitive. They matched. The statistics were overwhelming. The DNA on the murder weapon came from James J. White. The circle was now complete. The boast in Wyoming had given them a name. The discarded cigarette had given them the scientific proof. After 18 years, the ghost had a face. James J. White was arrested days later. But the battle was only half over. At trial, the defense would attack both the shaky memories of rehab and the complex science of old DNA. The killer's words had caught him. Now, would they be enough to convict him? The former police officer in rehab, Mark, broke group confidentiality to report what he heard. Do you believe he was right to do so? At what point does a moral obligation to justice override a promise of privacy? In Part 2, James White's boasts in rehab led detectives to his door, and his own discarded DNA sealed his fate. He was arrested. Now, the final act, a trial where the state would have to prove that the stories of a killer were more than just stories. Part 3 is the story of the trial. The prosecution had to convince a jury that words spoken in a Wyoming rehab room were a true confession, and that DNA recovered from a stone after 18 years was unassailable truth. The defense would attack both. The outcome would hinge on what the jury believed about memory, science, and the psychology of a man who couldn't keep his secret. The trial of James J. White began in February 2017 in Summit County's 3rd District Court. Prosecuting attorney Patricia Castle built her case on 2 parallel pillars. Pillar 1, the DNA. The state called forensic experts from the Utah State Crime Lab. They walked the jury through the journey of the river rock, from the 1995 evidence locker, to the 2008 touch DNA testing, to the 2013 match from the cigarette. They explained the science of low copy number DNA analysis used on the degraded sample. They presented the statistics, probabilities in the trillions that the DNA on the rock belonged to someone other than James White. The defense would later argue about contamination and degradation, but the state's presentation was clear, methodical, and visually powerful, displaying the matching genetic markers for the jury. Pillar 2, the confession. This was the dramatic heart of the trial. The state called the witnesses from the Life Skills Learning Center. One by one, they took the stand. Mark, the former officer, testified with measured clarity. Other residents, some nervous, some reluctant, corroborated the essence of White's stories. The river, the rock, the removal of teeth, the boast of getting away with murder. The consistency across their testimonies, despite the years that had passed, was striking. They described not a man expressing guilt, but a man holding court, imparting a dark lesson. Castle also presented evidence of White's presence in Utah in 1995 and his history of violence. She was constructing a narrative. Here is a violent man who was in the right place at the right time. His own words described the unique, hidden details of the crime, and his DNA is on the murder weapon. The defense strategy was two-pronged: discredit the witnesses and discredit the DNA. They portrayed the rehab witnesses as unreliable. They were addicts, people with troubled pasts and potentially faulty memories. The defense suggested they might have colluded or were seeking favor with authorities. They hammered on the idea that group therapy was a place of storytelling and hyperbole, not factual confession. Their attack on the DNA was more technical. They brought in their own expert who questioned the integrity of a DNA sample stored for 18 years and tested with sensitive modern techniques. Could it have been contaminated? Could the partial profile be a mixture misinterpreted? They argued the science wasn't as definitive as the prosecution claimed, introducing the shadow of reasonable doubt. James White did not take the stand. His presence in the courtroom was a silent, imposing fact. In her closing argument, Prosecutor Patricia Castle masterfully wove the two pillars together. She addressed the defense's attacks head-on. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "the defense wants you to believe in a series of impossible coincidences." She held up a photograph of the river rock. "They want you to believe that James White, for no reason, decided to terrify his rehab group with a detailed story about a murder by a river in Utah, involving a rock and the removal of teeth, a detail known only to police and the killer." She then displayed the DNA match report. "And they want you to believe that this same James White, who just happened to invent this very specific story, also just happens to have his DNA on the murder weapon from that very specific unresolved murder." She paused, letting the absurdity of the coincidence settle in the room. "What are the odds? These are not coincidences. These are the footprints of a guilty man. A man who carried this secret for 18 years and, in a moment of weakness, in a need to feel powerful again, handed it to you. He told you what he did, and science proved it." The defense closed by reiterating the fallibility of memory and the complexity of the science, urging the jury not to convict on what they called stories and speculation. The jury deliberated. They had to weigh the cold, hard data of science against the human, messy testimonies from the rehab center. They had to decide if the puzzle pieces, the words, the DNA, the location, fit together beyond a reasonable doubt. On November 7, 2017, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of murder, James J. White was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, members of Crystal Beslanowicz's family faced him. They spoke of a sister, a daughter, whose life was reduced to a file folder and a rock. They spoke of decades of unanswered questions, now finally, painfully, answered. White showed no emotion. He maintained his silence to the end, a control he could finally legitimately exert. This case is a classic study in offender psychology post-crime. James White successfully avoided detection for 18 years. His undoing was not a lapse in operational security, but a psychological imperative. Forensic psychologists posit that for some offenders, particularly those who commit violence as an expression of power, the crime is not complete without recognition. The secret becomes a trophy, but a trophy hidden in a vault is meaningless. There is a compulsion to display it, even if in a veiled way. The rehab setting was perfect for this. It was a captive audience of individuals he perceived as weaker, in a hierarchy he sought to dominate. By telling his story, he was not confessing guilt. He was demonstrating his superiority, his capability, his immunity. He was, in a twisted way, seeking admiration for his craft. The details about the teeth were his way of showcasing his expertise. It was the equivalent of a master carpenter describing a secret joint. He miscalculated. He misjudged his audience. He assumed his stories would only cement his image as a formidable figure. He never anticipated a listener trained to hear a confession hiding within a boast. The legacy of this case is profound. For cold case units, it's a blueprint. The marriage of persistent forensic review with proactive investigative work, triggered by human intelligence. For families of victims, it's a fragile hope that time does not erase all truths. But the central, haunting question remains about the killer himself. James White maintained control for 18 years through silence. His ego is what ultimately demanded to be fed, and that demand broke his control. 1. James White's need to brag outweighed his instinct for self-preservation. In your view, does this make such offenders ultimately vulnerable, or does it show a different priority system where social dominance is more important than freedom? 2. If the former police officer had not been in that rehab group, would James White ever have been caught? Does this case suggest justice sometimes relies on improbable, almost fictional twists of fate? This has been the story of Crystal Bislanowicz and the killer who could not stay silent. If you found this exploration of psychology and justice compelling, please subscribe to Behind the Crime Files. We delve deep into the stories where truth hides, not just in evidence, but in the human need to be seen. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Thank you for watching.